What if Donald Trump's pressure campaign against Canada was built on a fundamental miscalculation? What if the leverage he believed he held was never real? What if the structural dependency runs in the opposite direction? Because tonight, Pentagon officials are warning the White House that U.S. fighter jet production depends on Canadian nickel. And without access to that supply, America's most advanced military aircraft cannot be built. This is no longer about tariffs or rhetoric. This is about material power. And Canada holds it. The Pentagon has issued a direct warning to the Trump administration. U.S. defense contractors cannot produce F-35 fighter jets without access to Canadian nickel. That supply is not easily replaceable. It is not symbolic. It is operational. The F-35 program represents the backbone of American air superiority. It is the most expensive weapons system in U.S. history, and it depends on a mineral that Canada controls. This is not a policy preference. This is a structural fact. For months, Donald Trump has threatened Canada with tariffs, trade restrictions, and economic pressure. He has framed himself as holding leverage over Ottawa. He has claimed that Canada needs the United States more than the United States needs Canada. He has suggested that economic punishment would force Canadian compliance. But the Pentagon's warning changes that framing entirely. Because if U.S. defense production depends on Canadian resources, then the dependency is not one-sided. It is mutual, and in some sectors, it runs against Trump's narrative. Let's be clear about what nickel means in this context. Nickel is a critical component in high-performance alloys used in military aircraft. The F-35 requires specific grades of nickel for its airframe, engine components, and structural integrity. These are not generic materials. They require precision sourcing. And Canada is one of the largest and most reliable suppliers of that grade of nickel to the United States. The distinction matters, because this is not about consumer goods. This is not about household appliances or trade balances. This is about defense readiness. If the supply chain is disrupted, F-35 production slows. If production slows, delivery schedules fall behind. If delivery schedules fall behind, U.S. military commitments to allies are jeopardized. The consequences are operational, not political. Now consider the timing. The Pentagon's warning comes as Trump escalates pressure on Canada. He has threatened additional tariffs. He has publicly attacked Canadian leadership. He has suggested that Canada is taking advantage of the United States. But while Trump has been framing Canada as vulnerable, the Pentagon has been assessing actual dependencies. And those assessments show something different. They show that in critical sectors, the United States relies on Canadian resources in ways that cannot be quickly substituted. This creates a strategic contradiction. Trump is threatening economic consequences against a country that supplies materials essential to American defense production. That is not leverage. That is risk. If you value serious geopolitical analysis that tracks real dependencies rather than political rhetoric, subscribe to Canada Today. We focus on structural power, not headlines. The Pentagon's concerns are not abstract. Defense officials have made clear that disruptions to Canadian nickel supply would affect production timelines. Lockheed Martin, the primary contractor for the F-35 program, sources materials through integrated North American supply chains. Those chains include Canadian mining, refining, and processing operations. Tariffs or trade restrictions that disrupt those operations do not punish Canada in isolation. They disrupt American defense contractors. Economic nationalism does not override material reality. If the supply is not available domestically in sufficient quantity or quality, then external sources matter. And Canada is not a hostile power. It is a treaty ally. It is integrated into NORAD. It is part of NATO. Threatening that ally over trade disputes while depending on its resources for defense production creates institutional friction inside Washington. And that friction is now visible. Pentagon officials are reportedly pushing back internally against trade policies that could jeopardize defense supply chains. This is not partisan opposition. This is operational concern. When military planners warn that policy decisions threaten readiness, that carries weight. It suggests that Trump's political goals are colliding with institutional priorities. The question lawmakers are now asking is straightforward. If Canada controls a resource critical to U.S. defense, why is the administration threatening economic retaliation that could disrupt access to that resource? The logic does not align. Trade hawks argue for reducing dependency on foreign suppliers. But reducing dependency requires alternatives. And those alternatives do not exist in the short term for high-grade nickel used in military applications. Mark Carney has not needed to escalate. He has not issued threats. He has not retaliated publicly because the structural reality does the work for him. Canada supplies critical minerals. The United States needs those minerals. That is not rhetoric. That is geology and supply chain infrastructure. Carney's strategy has been to allow that reality to become clear without forcing confrontation. While Trump has been loud, Carney has been patient. While Trump has threatened, Carney has diversified. While Trump has framed Canada as dependent, the Pentagon has been documenting mutual dependencies that complicate that narrative. This is strategic discipline. Carney does not need to win public arguments if the underlying facts support his position. This development also exposes a broader problem in Trump's approach. He has treated trade relationships as zero-sum competitions where pressure produces compliance. But complex supply chains do not work that way. When production depends on cross-border integration, unilateral pressure creates vulnerabilities on both sides. Threatening a supplier does not make alternative suppliers appear. It creates risk. The F-35 program is not a minor issue. It represents decades of investment, hundreds of billions in contracts, and commitments to allied nations who have purchased the aircraft. If production is delayed because of trade disputes with Canada, that damages U.S. credibility with allies. It raises questions about reliability. It undermines the strategic rationale for the program itself. Defense analysts are now warning that politicizing supply chains for critical military systems introduces instability that adversaries can exploit. If U.S. defense production can be disrupted by trade disputes with allies, that is a strategic weakness. It is not strength. It is fragility disguised as toughness. The Pentagon's warning is not a suggestion. It is a constraint. It tells the White House that certain economic policies carry operational costs that defense planners are not willing to accept. That is institutional pushback, and it indicates that Trump's room to maneuver is narrower than his rhetoric suggests. For Canada, this shifts the conversation entirely. Carney is not asking for concessions. He is not begging for relief. He is operating from a position where the material facts support patience. If the United States needs Canadian resources for its most critical defense programs, then economic threats lose their edge, because the cost of disruption falls on both sides. And in some cases, it falls more heavily on the side making the threats. This is not about military confrontation. This is about economic structure. Canada does not need to threaten to withhold nickel. The mere fact that the dependency exists changes the strategic calculation. Trump can escalate verbally, but if that escalation jeopardizes defense production, the Pentagon will resist. And that resistance is already happening. If you want analysis that tracks institutional friction and structural dependencies rather than surface-level political drama, subscribe to Canada Today. We examine power where it actually operates. Trump framed his approach to Canada as dominance. He suggested that pressure would force compliance. He claimed that Canada had no alternatives. But the Pentagon's warning shows that dependencies run in multiple directions. And when those dependencies involve national security, political bluster becomes a liability. Mark Carney's strategy is working because it is based on patience and structural leverage. He did not need to match Trump's volume. He needed to allow the institutions inside Washington to recognize the constraints that material reality imposes. And that recognition is now occurring. Pentagon officials are warning the White House. Defense contractors are flagging supply chain risks. Lawmakers are questioning the logic of threatening a critical ally. This is not capitulation. This is recognition. The United States and Canada are integrated economically in ways that make unilateral punishment costly for both sides. But when one side depends on the other for defense production, the cost-benefit calculus shifts. And that shift is now visible. Donald Trump threatened Canada. He believed he held leverage. But the Pentagon has just informed him that in critical sectors, the leverage runs the other way. Canada supplies the nickel that builds America's most advanced fighter jets. Without that supply, production stops. That is not political theater. That is material dependency, and it cannot be negotiated away with threats. Trump attempted to project strength. Instead, he exposed vulnerability. He attempted to pressure Canada. Instead, he triggered warnings from his own defense establishment. He attempted to demonstrate dominance. Instead, he revealed dependency. The F-35 was supposed to represent American military superiority. Now it represents the limits of economic nationalism when supply chains cross borders. Mark Carney did not need to win this argument publicly. He needed to let the facts speak. And they are speaking loudly to the Pentagon, to Congress, to defense contractors. The message is simple. Canada is not a problem. Canada is a partner, and threatening that partner jeopardizes American interests. If you value reporting that focuses on structural realities rather than political posturing, subscribe to Canada Today. Because sometimes the real story is not what leaders say. It is what the supply chains require.